Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Immigration and Mobility Decoded, a podcast about all things immigration, global mobility, and everything else in between. Eric, how are we doing today?
Doing good, Finn. It was a good weekend here in Chicago for the weekly weather update that we've been doing in the last couple of weeks. It was in the 80s these last couple of days, but today on Monday, April 17th, it is currently snowing. So that's the wild swing of weather here in Chicago. How are you?
I'm good. It seems like it's been that way across the whole country. I know last week, lots of folks in the Midwest and the East were enjoying the summer-like weather. I took my dog out for a walk on Friday, and the humidity was at 80% in Maine, which was very, very strange. So
yeah, that humidity gets you.
Yeah, it was a weird experience for April, but it's back down to normal here. We're not getting snow; we're getting rain instead. But yeah, definitely looking forward to the next month or so when it's going to be a bit nicer.
Well, yeah, the weather. I wish we could probably have a full episode on this, but this isn't. Before we were recording, we were talking about Succession and last night's episode, and we can have a full Succession pod on it. But we won't as much as we want to talk about it. But let's just say another very good episode.
It was, yeah. I don't think we've asked our guests if they're watching Succession. The Last of Us was the prominent show.
Yes.
At the beginning of when we started the podcast about a month and a half ago. So we'll have to start asking the next few guests if they're watching Succession.
There you go. No, it's actually funny you bring up The Last of Us. Because when we did start this podcast about a month ago, beginning of March, that was the hit TV show. And we're doing this intro. This is episode 7 now. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. Just a little bit more focus on some recent immigration news and some articles that we want to talk a little bit more about. And then, Finn, you had a recent conversation with a partner at Global Immigration Associates, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. But so episode 7, 6 episodes have been recorded with a couple different guests. Finn, how's this journey coming along so far? I think we were talking about this podcast at the end of last year, and we really embraced it. And yeah, so here we are. How are you feeling?
I mean, it's been great. I think we tell every guest after we stop recording that selfishly, this experience of starting a podcast has been great for us because we just get to talk to really smart people and pick their brains about stuff that we're interested in. Thus far, it seems like there's other folks who listen in who also get a lot of value out of the conversations we have with the interesting folks we've had on. So we're looking forward to continuing to bring on lots more really, accomplished, experienced, and smart guests to share those conversations with the audience. But what are your thoughts, Eric? Your reflections on this so far?
Yeah, no, I echo your sentiments. I think it's always great to talk with to hear different viewpoints on immigration and mobility. We talked with Arf Kimani from Mob Squad, and he's based in Canada, so he has a pretty ground's eye view of immigration in Canada, and just diving a little bit more into the Canadian immigration system and how much it differs from the U.S., particularly when it comes to various pathways and how quickly they're able to kind of tweak their system to meet the needs, and just how much they're embracing immigration. Their immigration levels plans, they're well on track for that. And then last week's episode when we talked with former Ambassador John Feely, that was super interesting, just to kind of hear the viewpoints of someone who has worked in government, and he was a ambassador to Panama. Love that conversation. And Cecilia Esterline, she's a immigration analyst at the Niskanen Center, and she put together a really good article and research on 5 ways that the Biden administration can fix the immigration system here in the U.S. And I found that super interesting because it hit on some of those suggestions that we really hadn't seen before, in particular, like expanding the J1 to cover like healthcare workers or home healthcare workers. That was a super interesting idea. Like you said,
and then a scan center's one to watch, and a think tank that we're always paying attention to, because one of those 5 proposals was bringing back stateside visa renewals for certain visa holders, employment-based visa holders in the U.S. And the government actually announced that they'll be doing that later this summer.
Yep.
So I don't know what went on behind the scenes and how much involvement any of the folks at Niskanen had in convincing the Biden administration to take that action. But it is great to see that, despite a lot of shortcomings, and despite a lot of, let's say, unfortunate backtracking under the Trump administration when it comes to the U.S. immigration system, the past few years, there have been some important but under the radar leaps forward in improving immigration policy. And that's something, we plan to continue to cover here at the podcast, and something we plan to continue to ask our guests about. One of my favorite parts of having these folks on the podcast is asking them, like we did with Chris Richardson, former U.S. visa officer and now at BDB Solutions. We asked him what he would do if he was czar of immigration, how he would improve the system. Mm-hmm. He just had some really interesting suggestions that were fun to hear and imagine in an ideal world.
Yeah, no, that was a great conversation as well. I loved hearing those suggestions. So definitely recommend everyone check out those episodes if you haven't already. So yeah, Finn, there's two recent articles that came out, one from Marketplace and then one, an opinion piece from Paul Krugman at the New York Times, kind of on the similar topic. And that's just immigration and the larger economy. So just to quickly recap the Marketplace one, immigration is slowly increasing after a stark pandemic drop. Finn, as I'm sure you know, and as our listeners know, that the pandemic really affected immigration numbers. They severely declined, due to the pandemic, as well as restrictions put in place by the Trump administration. In fact, according to the Migration Policy Institute, the number of legal immigrants coming to the U.S. was cut in half between 2019 and 2020. Lately, those numbers have rebounded, and similarly, Paul Krugman hits on that, that immigrants are it seems that the rebound in immigration is helping the economy perform better than maybe what we've been hearing about. So I'm curious, Finn, what are your thoughts on these two articles, but then overall immigration's impact on the U.S. economy, maybe performing better than what we were anticipating?
Yeah, Eric, in that op-ed by Paul Krugman, he cites that the economy added 236,000 jobs last month. And that's a trend that we've seen happening month after month, again and again, that the economy continues to add jobs. And one sector where jobs continue to grow, despite there being layoffs that were announced mostly in the fall of 2022, is the tech sector. A stat that Envoy CEO Dick Burke loves to cite is the STEM unemployment rate and how consistently low it is. I just looked it up, and for March 2023, the unemployment rate for computer and mathematical occupations, which we commonly refer to as just the STEM unemployment rate, those are folks who work in STEM fields in the U.S., is 2.2%, which is typically, most economists will tell you, far below full employment, normal employment for that range. And meanwhile, we don't have the numbers out yet, but Ian Love, who we'll speak to briefly at the end of this episode, is predicting that anywhere between 700 and 800,000 H-1B cap registrations were submitted this year, based off of some of the numbers he's seeing internally and from his colleagues who work with clients that submitted registrations in the H-1B lottery this year from across the country. So if that's true, or if it's anywhere close to 700,000 registrations for H-1B high-skilled foreign nationals this year, with only 85,000 available, that just shows that, okay, the U.S. is going to keep adding jobs, but are we going to have the talent to fill those jobs, especially in key sectors like STEM fields, which some of our most innovative companies need employees to fill those roles? I don't know.
Wait, just going back to what you just said, I know USCIS hasn't released the official numbers yet, But Ian Love, he thinks that there are almost like 700 to 800,000 electronic registrations submitted this year.
Yeah. Based on,
Wow.
it could be that high. It could be lower, but based on the, and again, we'll hit on it later in the episode when we talk with Ian briefly, but based on the numbers that he's seeing at Global Immigration Associates at his firm, and then his colleagues at other law firms who, again, work with clients across the country, the selection rate that they're seeing for their clients is around 5 to 20%. And again, if it's closer to that 5% number, that if you do a simple equation, you do the math, that means that there's, like Ian said, upwards of 700,000 or 800,000 registrations, which would almost double the number of registrations last year.
That's a wild number to hear because, yeah, as you said, there's only 85,000 total H-1B visas, and it's been that way for years. So it's like you said, there's just clearly this demand for high skilled foreign talent, but there's not enough options. There's not enough H-1B visas for them. So
no, and I'll add that we've talked about it a few times on the podcast here, but Envoy's immigration trend survey predicted this demand a little bit, right? We found that in our survey, 71% of companies that we surveyed said that in Q1 of 2023, they were recruiting more foreign national employees than in Q1 of 2022. And the Department of Labor's released data on labor condition applications, which is a prerequisite document that employers need to file with the Department of Labor in order to sponsor an individual on an H-1B visa. And for Q1 of 2022, so Q1 of last year, that was like a record high demand for foreign talent. So in our survey, the writing was already on the wall, according to our respondents, that, hey, there's still a really, really high demand for foreign talent. The H-1B lottery may be another fact point there, showing that the demand is still high. And as writers and economists like Krugman are correctly pointing out, without immigration, the economy probably wouldn't be continuing to grow at the same rate that it is.
Right. And then that leads to the longer term viewpoint of making the case for more immigrant, or for changing up the U.S. immigration system to allow for more legal immigration, so we can so the U.S. can fill job openings, employers can fill those, find the high skilled talent, or other sectors. You mentioned the H-2As, we have the H-2Bs. So Krugman writes that long run concerns about U.S. finances are largely driven by a rising old age dependency ratio, and he notes that the recent surge in immigration, a lot of those individuals are of working age. So new immigrants are coming in and they're working, and it's leading to better economic conditions than what we were anticipating. And going back to the start of it, there was that I'm going to butcher the saying, but that saying of ex-economists predicted 3 of the last 29 recessions or something. We've been hearing talks about recession, but so far as we can tell, it hasn't happened yet. Yes, inflation is still high, but the recent report from last week shows it's coming down.
Yeah, and one of the topics that's been reoccurring with the guests we've chatted with thus far in the last 6 episodes of the podcast is the fact that other countries are proactively changing their immigration systems and their immigration policies to welcome more talent from overseas, to bolster their economies and to safeguard their economy against some of the pressures that we hear about in the news all the time.
Yeah. Well, look at a good example of that is Germany. They're in the midst of overhauling their immigration system to make it easier to work in Germany, but also then to obtain German citizenship, because their workers are aging, and they need to replace them in order to keep their economy humming. So that's a good example of what you just said.
Yeah, I attended a virtual event last week hosted by the Migration Policy Institute, The event was called Meeting Global Skills and Talent Needs in Changing Labor Markets. Bit of a mouthful there. But it was a great event hosted by MPI, great institution. All of our audience should head over to the Immigration Policy Institute's website and check out their research. They're one of the leading think tanks, institutions in the world covering U.S. immigration trends, but also immigration trends in countries around the world. And this virtual event was a branch of that. They had Jadu, who's the director of USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, there. And then they also had essentially her counterparts. So folks from Canada, the European Commission, and Australia, who head up the immigration departments in those countries. And the four of them talked about what actions their agencies are taking in their respective countries to try to improve the immigration process to, not just welcome foreign talent and make it a little bit easier for, students and high skilled professionals and workers in key industries where those countries need to fill talent gaps are. They were also just talking about how they can remove roadblocks, which is something that we've discussed with our guests a lot, Eric, is how the U.S. has far too many roadblocks that stand in the way between an employer hiring somebody for a job and that person actually being able to get the visa, the work authorization they need to come here. We'll add a link to that conversation. It's on Vimeo. I'll add a link to that conversation in the show notes, but I definitely recommend checking it out. Having a panel of the leaders of departments from the respective departments of immigration from these various countries, all in one room talking about, one virtual room, I should say, talking about how they're improving the immigration system or how they're working the immigration system in their countries was quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And, those hurdles, I imagine most listeners in the U.S. know and have experienced those hurdles. If not, I think that, this year's Immigration Trends Report does a good job of capturing some of those hurdles and things that, respondents would like to see changed. Finn, what, going to that Immigration Trends Report, what has stood out most to you about the report since it's been released in early March?
So I think what got the most media attention from the survey, and just for listeners who may be hearing about it for the first time, back in February, Envoy conducted a survey of 500 corporate professionals who specialize in immigration and global mobility for their companies. So these are folks with job titles like global mobility manager, immigration specialist, et cetera. And these were all US-based individuals. So Envoy surveyed 500 of these folks from companies across the country. And the data, the responses that stuck out the most and were covered the most by the media were the fact that a lot of U.S. companies are getting fed up with the barriers in the U.S. immigration system that are either delaying or preventing them from sponsoring and hiring the foreign talent that they need on a U.S. visa and bring them here. And because of that frustration, companies are not just looking at alternatives overseas, but they're actually acting by moving folks who they would have hired in the US to Canada, to the UK, to Germany, to destinations around the world where the immigration system is just much faster, much more efficient, and much more of a sure thing. And I think what's most interesting about those findings, and when you compare them to the conversations we've had in the last 6 weeks with our guests, it's that employers want to hire foreign talent. They want to hire folks, immigrants, to come to the U.S. and work in the U.S., but the barriers are just becoming too high. One great example that we've just touched on, right, is the fact that last year there were almost 500,000 registrations for the H-1B lottery, only 85,000 slots available. We don't have the numbers yet, but it could be as high as 700,000 or 800,000 registrations, again, for only 85,000 slots. I think that's been the most compelling finding from that survey, is that employers in 2023 want to hire talent here. They want to bring in immigrants to work in the U.S. in these coveted roles, a lot of which are STEM roles, but that they're not able to. And so they're sending them to Canada, where you mentioned our conversation with Arf Kamani from Mob Squad. It can take as little as 4 weeks to get work authorization in Canada and get somebody placed in an office in Vancouver, Waterloo, or wherever to begin working there.
Yeah, comparing the hurdles and seeing how other countries have maybe respond is not the right word, but change their immigration systems to be maybe because they have the same hurdles. And you mentioned Canada, but also look at like the UK, and they're creating new pathways for, yes, they might be like niche pathways, but there's still pathways for individuals and companies to to hire and send talent, to hire talent in the UK or send talent to the UK. There was that one recent one from, I believe, last year. It was, if you graduated from a certain top university in the world, you could live and work in the UK for a set period of time. So it's things like that. And then you compare it to the US, where we've talked about it almost with every guest so far. Just the lack of immigration reform, and just the dim. There's nothing on the horizon that to just given the current makeup of the government, that would lead us to believe that there would be any semblance of immigration reform here in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Now there are, and we touched on it briefly, there are some minor changes that USCIS, that some of the other agencies that manage immigration for the U.S. government are taking. And a couple of those we'll talk with Ian Love, partner at Global Immigration Associates, about. I had the chance to just hop on a quick call with him and ask a few questions about some of those trends that he's been covering. The first is the 60-day grace period for H-1B holders who either quit their job or get laid off by a company. Those folks have 60 days to find a new job and have that employer file an H-1B petition on their behalf. And if they don't do that, they are forced to leave the U.S. That was a pretty hot topic a couple of months ago when there were, a lot of layoffs in the news cycle. And Ian has some really interesting thoughts about how employers can approach hiring and sponsoring foreign nationals who have been laid off and are in that 60-day window. And he also talks about there are some rumors that USCIS will extend that 60-day grace period to 180 days sometime in the near future. Ian talks about what the actual implications of USCIS doing that would be and how they would enact it if the rumors are true. Then the other thing we talked to him about is something we've alluded to a few times in this conversation, which is, where are the registration numbers from the H-1B lottery for this year? I was looking at the USCIS website from last year, and it was around mid to late April when they released the registration numbers from the fiscal year 2023 H-1B cap. So hopefully we'll get those numbers soon. But Ian expands on what he predicts will happen in terms of the total registration numbers this year for the lottery, as well as what the implications of duplicate registrations are. So those are employers who are those are individuals who get a registration submitted in the H-1B lottery for them by more than one employer, and how USCIS might be able to manage that in the future.
And this was a potential concern, wasn't it? Back when USCIS announced the shift to an electronic registration system, because with the old cap, everyone would put together the petition all up front, submit it to USCIS, and then they would select it. But now, by lowering the barrier of entry, as of now, that $10 registration fee, although that might increase in the future, and even if it does, according to the trends report that you alluded to earlier, employers would still pay that increased registration fee for an H-1B electronic registration. But this was a concern of by lowering the barrier of entry, you'd increase the number of registrations, even though the number of visas available has still remained at 85,000.
Yeah, that was definitely a concern. And, it seems to be playing out as a valid one in the last couple of years, right? Like you said, there is a proposal being discussed right now to raise the fee for USCIS, to raise the registration fee from $10 to $215 likely, which would, if it were to be instituted, it would be instituted for next year's H-1B cap. But like you said, our survey, the Envoy Trend Survey, found that most employers would be willing to pay that increased fee, and it wouldn't impact how many registrations they would submit. And then there's a question, and hopefully USCIS eventually releases some information on this, of whether the influx of these registrations are causing the technical delays that we saw with the registration platform, with the registration website, with USCIS. We, of course, saw that occur 2 days before the intended last day for registration in mid-March this year.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because this was the first, I believe, the first time that they had technical difficulties. Registration launched in the spring of 2020, so right at the start of the pandemic. And it survived that, obviously 2021, 2022. And so, yeah, it will be interesting to see those numbers and if that played any role in the technical difficulties that they had. Yeah, Finn, anything else? Otherwise, I think that's almost a perfect segue to your conversation with Ian Love, partner at Global Immigration Associates. But anything else to add?
No, excited to share the short conversation I had with Ian. And he's a really smart guy with great takes on what's going on in the high-skilled immigration world. So we're excited to share that with the audience and hopefully bring you more in the future.
Totally. Yeah, and I think before that, though, if you're watching on YouTube, definitely don't forget to like this video as well as subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, definitely would appreciate a follow. All of that continues to help the show grow, and for us to keep putting great content in front of everyone. So with that, we have Finn's conversation with Ian Love coming up now.
Ian, we're recording this on Friday, April 14th. As of today, USCIS has yet to release the total number of registrations submitted in the fiscal year 2024 H-1B cap. Why do you think USCIS has yet to release those numbers? And how many registrations in total do you think will be reported for this year?
Well, yeah, you're correct, Ben, that we haven't seen the total number of registrants be released yet. But what we have seen for our firm and what we're hearing from other firms as well is the selection rate is hovering around 15, maybe 20% for some clients that got a little bit more fortunate. And that's been just a year-over-year decrease ever since USCIS started the H-1B cap registration lottery. So what that suggests is that the number of registrants being submitted is increasing every year, while the supply remains stagnant at 85,000 new cap slots available each year. Now, USCIS has not yet released the total number of registrations submitted, but if you extrapolate from the 15 to 20% selected, that ends up with probably something in the range of 700,000 to 800,000 potentially that were submitted into the registration lottery. We do expect that USCIS will release that number eventually. One key data point that they haven't provided in previous years when they released the total numbers is how many of those are duplicate registrations for the same person. The regulations governing the cap registration prohibit the same employer from submitting multiple registrations to the same person, but that doesn't prevent multiple employers from registering one person. So some employees may get multiple employers to submit a registration for them in order to increase their chances of getting at least one selection with some employer. But then when multiple people do that, which is understandable because they want to increase their individual chances. But when multiple people do that, then that number grows and grows. It increases the total number of registrants and then decreases the selection odds overall. So in addition to just seeing the total number of registrations submitted, it would be really a key data point to also see if USCIS would release the number of registrations submitted for the same person by multiple different companies.
Ian, just a few months ago, a big story in the news were how H-1B employees were being impacted by the layoffs that were mainly centered in the tech and finance industries. Can you explain what happens to an H-1B employee when they are laid off?
So H-1B workers generally have a 60-day grace period after the termination of their employment in which they can find a new employer to file a new H-1B petition for them without them having to depart the country. So practically speaking, though, when it takes at least a couple of weeks in most situations, sometimes longer, for a new employer to prepare an H-1B petition. When you factor in other causes that can lead to delay in petition preparation processes, realistically, that means that H-1B workers have about a 30-day period in which to find a new employer and then have that new employer prepare and file a new petition for them within that 60-day grace period. It's still possible for them to get a new job, have a new employer file a petition for them even after that time period, but in almost all situations, they would have to leave the country and re-enter, which makes them a much less desirable candidate to the employer, given the additional hassle of onboarding them. So it really can be quite stressful for people who, in many cases, have been in the U.S. for years, may have to consider, are looking for a new job while considering, am I going to have to break my lease? Or maybe they have a mortgage, maybe they have a car loan, they have kids enrolled in school. They've really started to put down roots in the U.S., even though they're on a temporary visa. And so that could be a really stressful, additional stress on top of the stress that anyone would experience while going through that situation. So there has been an advisory council that has recommended extending the grace period to 180 days. Currently, it is written into federal regulations that the grace period is 60 days, so it would require some regulatory process updates, we expect. But its practical impact, if that does go forward, is that in fact it would multiply by 5 the amount of time the employee has to find a job. Currently, I recommend, as I mentioned, it would be about 30 days to find a job and get a new employer to start filing a petition, but that would extend that 30 days to about 5 months until the employer has to start getting ready to file its petition to do it within 180 days. So really, that would be a big benefit to any laid off H-1B employees. One question, though, is whether it would be applicable retroactively, like if people whose 60 days had already expired would be granted the additional 120 days to reach 180, or if it only applied to people who lost their jobs going forward. So that would be a big question to resolve as well, but it could be a big potential benefit and relief to those who hold H-1B status.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Immigration and Mobility Decoded. If you watched this video on YouTube and you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Envoy Global YouTube channel for more content like this. Otherwise, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone.